Thanks for the kind words. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Let me jump right into this here. It is a pretty economics talk, but I still hope that everybody else will get some relation to it as well, because it is about LinkedIn profiles, and I think many people have their experiences with that, and probably therefore hopefully will find it interesting as well, even though it actually does address very standard classical econ questions really on how skills are relevant in the labor market. And it does address many aspects of inequality directly, even if not in the title, in the sense that we want to understand to what extent skills help us understand inequality in the labor market. And towards the end, I will actually talk a lot about gender gaps and gender inequality, and to what extent skills, as we can observe them on LinkedIn profiles, can help us better understand gender gaps in the labor market. This whole project is joint work with David Dorn in Zurich, and then Florian Schoner and Moritz Seebacher, who are with me in Munich. Actually, Moritz did his master here, so some of you probably still remember him. With Lisa Simon, she's at Revelio Labs, and you're going to see in a minute why that is very important for this project. So the background or the motivation for this is actually very straightforward. Like classical theories of human capital, like theories that try to link educational investments and skills to the labor market, the basic idea is that individuals can invest in skills that are valued in the labor market by employers, and so workers can enhance their potential to generate earnings either by education or by learning on the job. This is these classical theories by Gary Becker and Jacob Mincer. And then basically the returns will emerge from the supply and the demand for these skills, so they will be context specific, but the basic idea is that your productivity isn't externally given, but to some extent depends on your own investments in education and on the job learning. Now, when it comes to testing these type of theories, we have these two sorts of investments, and the way we usually measure them is by the years of schooling of workers and by the years of work experience. And that's really by convenience, because these are observed in many data sets, and then we try to use them as proxies for the resulting but usually unobserved skills of the actual workers. So we don't really, we know how, whether they went to college or not, we know how long they've been working, but we don't really generally observe what they actually, the skills they actually have, and we just use these investments as a proxy for the actual outcomes. Alternatively, there's actually some literature that tries to measure skills directly, but these usually are very specific subsets of skills. So I myself, we've been working quite a bit on cognitive skills like numeracy and literacy. Then there's a test for these out there, but this is of course a clear specific set of pretty basic skills that you observe there. Others look at other non-cognitive skills, particularly, for example, social skills, and have their specific measurements. But usually then you have 2 or 3 dimensions of skills that you try to measure there, but certainly not the full setup. But the kind of funny thing in this is that I guess the workhorse model these days that labor economists would have to try to think about most questions of labor markets, particularly how new technologies affect labor markets, is this task model. The idea is workers perform specific tasks. It's not just their occupation. It's really the specific tasks that are relevant in there. And for that, you actually have to think about workers possessing actually a large vector of distinct skills. And that's part of the theories in there. And these skills then qualify them to perform specific job tasks. And if these job tasks change, some of these skills may become less valuable and other more valuable in the labor market. The funny thing is, though, where the literature has done a lot of work in trying to measure these job tasks in a very detailed way, and hundreds of tasks often, when it comes to empirical work, actually even the most recent papers usually tend to measure the skills by often just one dummy, you went to college or not, or maybe 2 or 3 dummies. But it's really this very rough measurement, mostly by what you have in your data. The one direction where I think the literature has made huge advances in recent years in trying to measure skills like in a more multidimensional ways is this whole literature that look at as job advertisements, where you have like the job ads, these huge online databases, and using text analysis, then you try to measure what type of skills probably different employers are looking for, and then you define keywords that measure, like you define a certain skill category and look at keywords, whether they are in there. And I think one of the things we certainly have learned from that employers do search for a very wide range of worker skills that are like much more than like these 1 or 2 dimensions that you would often look at, and that's very important for them. What we don't really know, or at least don't have clear data on, is actually which group of workers do possess these skills that are valued by the employers, and then also how these skills then relate to workers' investments in terms of education and experience, and also to outcomes like earnings at for the individual workers, because you don't observe the workers here in the job ads data. I mean, to be honest, in most job ads, you don't even know whether this job was ever filled. It may never be filled, but if it's filled, you don't like. Certainly the worker won't have exactly the skills that an employer was looking for, and so that's really something we are missing out. And this is kind of the question on which we hope to add a little bit with this project. So what we're doing in this paper is that we're going to use data from profiles on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is this huge, like it's kind of the leading social media platform for professional networking that I guess all of you know. I'm going to tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But what we ultimately can do is we're going to work with nearly 9 million profiles from US college graduates that actually don't just have all sorts of kind of CV type of information on these profiles, but also self-report their skills. You have in the LinkedIn profiles this feature where you can just say, these are my skills. And people type in different things in there, and we try to use those information to get an idea about worker skills and how they relate to outcomes in the labor market. I guess this has a lot of like nice advantages and potentials. This has a lot of drawbacks that probably will be directly in your mind here, and I hope to talk about these things throughout the talk. So what we basically do, we use a word association algorithms to aggregate these like millions of individual text strings on skills that we have in the data. To ultimately, we're going to work with at the level of 48 skill clusters, and then can do different analysis. And just to give you an idea of where we're heading and what we're doing, so this is a totally descriptive paper, but we're going to do 3 types of empirical analysis that I think like show a little bit about the potential of using these LinkedIn data that bring something quite new to these type of analysis. And at the end of the day, I think they actually allow us actually to like learn some very important things that are very consistent with an important role of these multidimensional skills for many patterns on the labor market, for which we otherwise, I mean, never really had any evidence. Certainly there was a lot of theory around there, and that makes this nice. So like we're just going to start out by looking at how do these skills, as we measure them on LinkedIn profiles, are related to the more classical measures of human capital that we have, these investment measures, meaning schooling and work experience. And so one of the really interesting patterns, this was one of the first things I saw from these data that got me quite excited, is if you just look at the number of skills that people report on their profiles and plot it against age, you get this concave shape. I'm going to show you the details like later, where like people with more work experience report more skills in a way that's initially steep and then flattens out, which looks exactly like age earnings profiles that any labor economist will have in mind ever since Jacob Mintz's 1970 book, where like we've always like, you can see that if you look at earnings over age in the labor market, it's really always this concave pattern. And the story has always been like, okay, this has something to do with work experience, with on-the-job learning, but basically we never observed to what extent that's actually true. It's just like the idea that that could explain this, and our data here is super consistent with this type of an explanation. Another aspect in there that I find really interesting is if we subdivide the skills, like these 48 clusters, into 3 types of skills, like being occupation specific, so specific to some occupations, skills that are more generally usable across many occupations, and we separate out managerial skills as a third important factor, then we actually see that people, when they come out of college, they mostly have general skills, so skills that are not very specific. And then, as they age, with increasing experience, they have a larger and larger fraction of specific and managerial skills, which is, again, very consistent with the basic theories that we have in this area. Then the second type of analysis, we're going to look at how these skills relate to outcomes, meaning, so we don't observe individual level earnings on LinkedIn, but we're going to have a measure that is quite detailed for the specific job you have, meaning it's not just occupation, but so we know the firm that you're working with, we know like your seniority in the firm and so on. And based on that, we kind of have a prediction of like how highly paying the job is that you have. And we do see that workers that have more skills tend to have higher paying jobs, particularly for skills that are specific and managerial. And if you do a simple OLS regression, these skill differences that we observe can account for substantially more variation in this earnings measure than even very detailed vectors of classical measures of education and experience, including things like your field of study or the quality of your college and so on. So it seems like these skill measures actually have information that is relevant for earnings variation. And in the last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about differences across gender in these skill measures. And what we see is actually when people come out of college, there's hardly any gender gap. It's very small and actually fully accountable by occupational choice differences. But then, towards the late 20s, early 30s, there starts to be a huge, like an increasingly strong gap in the sense that women tend to report fewer skills than men. So these skill gaps do emerge at the typical ages of motherhood, and we're going to show with some analysis that descriptively these gender skill differences can be fully accounted for by the fact that women reduce work hours during motherhood. So it seems to be that while working less, you accumulate fewer skills, and that actually leads to this gap in self-reported skills. I'm going to talk much more about these things, the concerns you're probably going to have in mind right now, but isn't it gender-specific reporting biases in these analyses? That's, of course, a major concern in these things. But I think by now, I think we have gathered a lot of evidence that, to me, is very inconsistent with like huge gender differences in reporting in this type of a population we have, and that this really is mostly related to reduced work during motherhood. You're going to see later on what we can do there. And more generally, actually, these gender gaps in skills actually can account for quite substantial part of the gender earnings gaps as well. And so in the bottom line for this that I, for myself, take away from this project is that these, like once you can measure skills in a more multidimensional way, as on these LinkedIn profiles, we can actually account for several important labor market patterns that we have been thinking about, like these concave age earnings profiles or things like gender gaps that we can account for but couldn't with the more classical human capital measures. So in that sense, I think these LinkedIn skills, where they have a lot of deficiencies, are informative as a somewhat new measure of human capital that is more rich and more detailed than the usually available ones. And that's kind of the bottom line I take out there. It's not that they're going to replace the classical measures, but they certainly help us understand more patterns than the classical measures. Okay, so this is where we're going. You get you have the idea of what this is about in the structure. Now I'm going to tell you more about LinkedIn and the measurement of skills in there, and like a little bit more about the data we have and the sample. And then I'm going to go into these 3 types of analysis: how these skills are related to the investments, how they are related to earnings, and then the gender gap. Okay, by the way, it's good that I could actually give you at least the first idea of what we're going to doing here quite uninterruptedly to begin with, so you know where we're going. But please feel free now at any time to interrupt me and ask questions or anything else, because I know that there's you're going to have lots of concerns in your mind right now about these LinkedIn data, and you should. But before you think it's all total nonsense what I'm telling you because we forgot this or that, rather ask the questions, and I'll be happy to discuss that while we go along. Okay, I'm going to go on, but please feel free to interrupt anytime.
I think I will just quickly ask the first clarification question. So when we talk about the word classification, they're also on LinkedIn, you can upload skills, endorsements, but also you can put in certification courses that you've taken. So would you also classify those certificates, the text from the certificates as well? And does it act as a separate control or? Unfortunately
not. And the reason is that we cannot observe that. So the way this works, you're going to get that in a minute, is so it's very tough to scrape LinkedIn data. And since we've been working on this, we've been working on this for more than 3 years now. I talked with a lot of labor people who actually know a lot about scraping, which I don't know. And they tell me they knew many people who have tried but never managed to fully scrape the LinkedIn profiles. LinkedIn makes it very hard for researchers to do that. I mean, you can easily, but you can scrape things like aggregate data on all the graduates from a certain college and the like. These are actually features that are easy, but then the individual level data is much harder. The one thing that is actually, so what we have is the public information on these profiles, and things like the courses that you have there, or the endorsements, or even your networks, they're actually all part of the private part of a profile, and therefore it would not be legal to scrape it. So what you have to have in mind or think about is not what you see when you open a profile, because you're probably hooked onto LinkedIn, you were just signed on, and then you already see a lot of things. But when you hook on, you basically have signed all these, this long small print that you never read, which says you're not allowed to scrape this. And so LinkedIn tries very hard for others not to scrape their information, but they've been, I think, more than 50 court cases, and they actually lost 2 of them. And these were both related to the fact that as long as things are public, so everybody can view it, even without hooking onto the network, they cannot prevent people from scraping it because it's public. And then of course, they want to have a little bit of information that's public so as to entice other people to join the network. And that's exactly where we are entering in here in terms of with scraping these data. So it would be great to have, for example, endorsements or these, I would love to have it, but we don't.
You were mentioning these earnings, that they're correlated, skills are correlated with high-paying jobs, right? Is that internal, better internal jobs within a company or something, like a promotion within, or is it rather switching jobs to better-paying firms and so on? Or is it better-paying jobs in a better-paying industry or so?
I can. Let's get there when I get there, because for that actually you should actually know a bit more about the measures. It's actually so what I can tell you now, it is both within and across occupations that we see these analyses. I think we never really did within firm, although that would be feasible to do. On the other hand, there's probably limited variation in the earnings measure within firms. Well, no, it's we would have to look at it. We are actually within firms, we actually haven't started to do yet. I mean, the basic idea is, in most analysis that you think of, you wouldn't want to take out all the variation that is across occupations or across firms. On the other hand, it helps you to understand where this is, where the variation is coming from, and so we should actually look into that. Well, we haven't. Okay, LinkedIn. So it's this professional network. It's a platform that's really focusing on career development. So the idea is employers use it for job search, and employees use it for job search, and employers use it to recruit people. I think actually, even more generally, people just use it for networking more broadly. So I always had a feeling that until 1 or 2 years ago, academic economists are the only profession that is not on LinkedIn, but anybody who's in the private sector is just out there. And when I was talking to friends in the private sector, they always said, sure, you have to be on LinkedIn because everybody else is. And so when they, for the first time they meet a new customer, the first thing is they go into their LinkedIn profile and look up what type of a guy is that, what is their background, so I know with whom I'm going to be talking. And therefore, everybody seems to be there. So I think actually the use of this is actually far beyond the simple job search and recruitment part, but that's a big part of it. And so you've got to think about these online profiles very similar to a classical CV. So they would have information on your current, on your prior jobs, on your educational degrees. And we have this feature that you can report your skills in there that we're going to exploit for measuring skills. Now, the data set that we are using is actually, we didn't scrape ourselves, but we actually got from Revelio Labs. So Revelio Labs calls itself a workforce intelligence company. So they scrape all these LinkedIn profiles. These are pretty much semi-structured data sets, only the public part of the profiles. And then they pass and curate that information into a bit more structured database. The reason they are doing it is they basically sell this information to investors. So their basic business model, which I think is super successful, is that they say, look, investors know all sorts of things about different companies, but the one thing they don't have comparable information on is on the talent in the different firms, which is probably the most important thing these days for most of these firms. So like who's working there and so on. So basically what they can tell investors is like, how many IT specialists did this little firm like gain or lose during the past month, and so on. So you can do it on a very fine-grained basis. That's what they're using it for. And actually a former PhD student of mine, Lisa Simon, who actually then went on to work with Susan Athey in Stanford for a couple of years, then went to the private sector, and she's actually now the chief economist of Revelio Labs. And at some stage, she basically said, Ludger, we've got some interesting data, we should talk. And then I agreed that we should talk. That's how I stumbled into that. But then this has been a really super interesting experience because I thought like, yeah, this is something really new in there that should be very interesting to use. Something that people haven't been using yet. And so there's a chance we're going to learn something new from it. But there were many obstacles in there that, even though I think I wasn't naive when I started out this project, turned out to be much more complicated than we hoped. And that's really mostly on Moritz and Florian to solve all these problems. So when we first got this data set, after a lot of things about negotiations, about contracts and so on, there were several terabytes. And that's something I also usually don't have in my data sets, meaning you don't open several terabytes even in the working memory of your standard server. And so we had to learn on how to work in the cloud, and there's actually other programs with which you do that to extract the information that you want to have in there. But then, of course, it's not your standard administrative data set where you just do it. So for example, Revelio Labs said, okay, we've got all these algorithms, and for example, like we have the educational degrees on there, and then you open the data and you realize it's actually missing for 2/3 of the data, and then you look into the real data, so we have all the original text in these data sets, and you realize it's actually not that it's missing, it's just that it wasn't coded into a specific field or a specific degree, and so you actually have to develop your own algorithms to actually do this in a better way, and all this like took much longer than you would generally hope, but that was part of the deal of the project. What we ultimately have here, what I'm going to show you, is all based on one cross-section of LinkedIn profiles of workers who work in the US that have complete data on these things that we're generally interested in. So like for a while, we actually went back and forth. There's actually, there's many profiles that are somewhat incomplete. At the end of the day, we decided we want to have a reasonably clean data set, and we are not short of observations in here, and therefore we decided rather to have a clean data set. And it's going to be actually one cross-section in 2019. The main reason is that we want to stay before COVID and not be within the main COVID analysis, and there are several reasons why actually we couldn't be doing it in very recent data. Most biggest reason here is that by now the skill information is no longer in the public part of the profiles, and you couldn't even scrape it anymore. And then very early on, we decided we're actually going to focus on college graduates, because that's actually something we actually did think about even before that, because literally most college graduates in the US are on LinkedIn. If you just count the numbers, you are very close to the universe of college graduates in the US who are on LinkedIn. It's very different from non-college graduates, and then you get lots of issues about selectivity and so on, that we decided, okay, this is going to be a paper just on college graduates. Keep that in mind. We're going to look at people aged 23 to 64. They have to be working in the US, and they have to have at least one skill reported on their profile. And that gives us ultimately a data set of nearly 9 million profiles. So this is actually, in the end, it's probably roughly 1 out of 6 college graduates in the US for which we have full profiles, including skill information. And I'm going to show you later how this sample looks compared to the representative sample of college graduates in the US. And it's actually, there's going to be some differences that are kind of obvious, but it's not going to be super different. And I could do all the analysis. We have an appendix where we do all the analysis, like weighting our data set with observables to look like the college graduates in the US overall, and the qualitative results are going to be exactly the same that I'm talking about here. Okay, now what are these skills? So workers can just self-report whatever they want on their profile in this skill box. And they are meant to use it to describe their job relevant abilities. So basically, for empirical purposes, then our definition of skills is basically everything that workers enter as a skill on their profile. And so I had never put in any skill on my LinkedIn profile, even though I've been around there forever. And then, whatever, half a year ago, I ultimately decided at least I want to see how this works. And so I just opened this, and when you start typing, LinkedIn will, based on what you're typing, make you suggestions on what you can choose based on what other people have entered there. So it's kind of a semi-structured process where you kind of like, we see, okay, others have put in stator. I'm just going to click on stator. But you're really not constrained, and you can type in anything you want. So I typed in, my skill is doing research on LinkedIn skills, and that's there. It works. Like on the positive side about these skill measures, I think it is true that to indicate a skill on your LinkedIn profile is to some extent a high stakes activity, because these informations are widely used by recruiters. There's a lot of evidence that most recruiters on LinkedIn make use of these skills when they wonder whom to like invite for a job interview and these type of things. But there's of course a lot of negative aspects or concerns about these, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. But just to give you an idea of how this looks like, so the average profile in our data set would list 20 skills. Like we would have 20 entries in there, and the 10th to 90th percentile range is between 7 and 37 skills. So that's kind of the range that you have to imagine that people put in there. Now, let's talk about all the challenges of this type of a measure as a measure of your actual skills. So ideally, we would love to have data where workers continuously update their profiles and report their complete set of skills based on a consistent and objective assessment of these skills. And of course, we don't have that. It's actually probably true that for most of the skills we're looking at, there's not even any objective assessment measurement anyway. So, you know, that means there's no simple alternative out there if you really want to try to get a very multidimensional measure of skills. So there's a lot of challenges in there. Let me talk about 3 that I think are among the biggest in there. I mean, the first thing is people may just not update their profiles. You know, they may be dormant. They may not actually may have once put in a few skill information there and never cared about that again. So there's two things we can do to address this challenge. The first thing is actually we are going to limit the entire analysis that I'm going to show you to profiles that actually have very comprehensive information on the skills, on the education, and their full job history. So this is like a much shorter, smaller sample than the full sample. But then I'm going to show you at some stage a robustness check, which I think is like a very important, at least to me, analysis in here that tells me that what we're looking at is not going to be totally driven by lack of profile updating is that, like I'm going to show you results for a subsample of individuals who actually have changed their employer within the last 2 years. So by observing that they've changed their employer over the last 2 years, first thing is that we know they have updated their profile over the past 2 years, because otherwise you wouldn't see it in there. And secondly, probably these are people who were active on job search on the labor market and therefore care to update their skills. So if it would all be lack of profile updating, we shouldn't see any of the patterns in this sample, but actually all the qualitative patterns that I'm going to tell you here about are going to look very similar in this very selected sample. So it's a selected sample, so therefore it's actually probably not good as your main sample, but it does go through in here, meaning that, for example, if you see that older individuals have more skills, it's not just because younger people don't fully update their skills. I mean, in this case, it would actually be the other way around, to be honest. But it seems to be consistent in this subset of profiles.
So, Herr Wößmann, I've got a comment from the online audience, which I would like to share with you. So, Oliver Gassner says his experience from helping people to find jobs via Xing and LinkedIn is that especially people who are looking for a job are filling out the skills. So his hypothesis would be the longer you are in the market, the more often you are looking for a job, you will document more skills. So having the skills and documenting them might depend on this variable. So the way you address challenge 1 makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, good. I was about to say this is exactly why we're doing this. Thanks. No, that's exactly the point. Great. Phrased in a much better way than I was. Okay, let's move on. The second challenge would be that there could probably be a lot of very basic skills that you don't care to report. So if you've got a very high level, very specific IT skills, you probably don't also report that you also know Excel. Whereas if a person who the only IT skill they have is Excel, they may actually want to report it. So if you, and I think that's true in here, that is a downside of this skill measurement. But if you think about it, this would, in all likelihood, in all the things that we are looking at, result in biases against finding any relations that we are interested in. So that means that people who have more skills are going to underreport some of these. So that's actually the difference would be larger if you would fully observe all the basic skills as well. So it would bias against a relationship, say, between the number of reported skills and the human capital investments they have, and also the number of reported skills and whether you've obtained a higher paying job or not. So in that sense, this will work against us, and what you see here in that sense would be an underestimate of the associations. And then finally, and probably the deepest concern here is that the assessment of your skills may be very idiosyncratic. So some people will boast a lot of skills, others will be very cautious in reporting certain skills. People may understand the way you report these skills very differently. I mean, there's this one feature that we already talked about, is that you have this option that other users can endorse your skills. Unfortunately, we're not observing this, but at least it leads a little bit to kind of improved quality of what people do report. Otherwise, I would love to use this information. On the other hand, when you think about it a little bit more, it's actually most of the concerns that you would have wouldn't really be solved by these endorsements, because maybe the people you know, if you are a big boaster, your friends are also big boasters, and they're going to be more likely to endorse, and then you have the same type of biases in there. So if these type of idiosyncratic reporting differences are randomly distributed, they are really reporting noise. And if these are similar in different groups of workers, then the information on the average skill sets of these different groups of workers, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about here, is still meaningful, even if there's a lot of individual level noise in the data. And to that extent, I think many of these idiosyncrasies will just wash out in the analysis. But of course, you may be concerned that these noises are systematically different across different worker groups. And I think this is where then we have to go into the details. So maybe one of the concerns you may have that women are more likely to underreport compared to men the types of skills they have. And if that would be the case, that would bias analysis across genders. And like when I get to the gender analysis, I'm going to tell you, I think for these questions, we really have to go into the concrete questions that we have. And for the gender analysis, I will show you some analysis we did that actually speak against a huge gender bias in what we're looking at here, but we'll get there.
So, do I have to wait? Look, just to clarify, so you just using the number of skills there, right? Because, I mean, you could do some hierarchy there. If you know Python, you know Excel.
Yeah, no. That's so we're going to use the number and then also the type of skills in different dimensions that we're going to look at, and then like we're going to cluster these skills into different classes, and we're also going to use the number of skills in a given cluster, so you have a little bit of an intensity within certain skill clusters, but nothing beyond that. And I think this idea of like thinking about hierarchies of skills is really interesting, and we discussed that a lot, but we haven't gotten around to any idea to get an objective measure of skill hierarchies that we could use to do this that could help like lead some further. But so we haven't done that. Right. But I think in principle, I like the idea.
Future work. Okay.
Yeah.
May I ask one more question
Sure.
on the same? So I think with regards to the first challenge and the third challenge, would you also happen to have data that tells you something about people who are using the mobile application version versus the desktop version? Because then that's a signal of at least an increased likelihood of using the app more or even updating it. And the
so you mean people who use mobile are more likely to update? Is that
could be, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just curious about that.
I should know this now. I'm not 100% sure whether we do or do not have that information. Or probably not, because that would not be in the public profiles. No, I don't think we have it.
And in the
We've been
aspect
discussing that
of boasting, like your self-reported skills, there's also options that you could seek endorsements from previous employers. Like you can really, they're like push things. And is that information that, okay.
No, none of that is in the data. Okay, so here's the basic idea. Let's go a bit more directly in what we can measure in terms of skills, but also the other variables, and that gives you a better idea, I think, what I'm talking about. This is like a little bit abstract so far. So there's, in the data that we have, there's 1.8 million unique text strings in terms of what people have reported in terms of skills. That tells you, I mean, measuring skills with one dimension is a little bit awkward. What we're going to do is we aggregate these text strings into 48 skill clusters, and that's based on a very basic algorithm. That's actually something that Revelio Labs has done. It's nothing that we are doing. That they're doing that for their work. It's really one of these. So people who know this analysis, like one of these word-to-vec algorithms that's really based on word associations. So really it just means that you cluster different skills based on how they occur together in the data. So the more likely that two skills are co-occurring on individuals' patterns, the more likely they are moved into one cluster. I'm going to show you in a minute what this gives us. We're using this in a totally data-driven way of clustering or defining our skills. That has pros and cons. I think like the one thing is like this is going to be like using the universe of text that's in there rather than picking out individual ones, and it lets the data speak. So you're not putting in there what you wanted to get out afterwards. And I really wanted to avoid that we're just driving our results ourselves. So the alternative is the standard keyword type of approach that most people who do these job ad analysis are using. So you would say like, okay, I'm interested in cognitive skills. Here's usually like 10 to 15 individual keywords that are going to define our cognitive skills, and then I just do a search for these words in the job ads and just count them, and that's my measure of cognitive skills. But like for some of the things we've been doing, we're actually trying to do the keyword approach as well, and it actually does look very similar to what we're getting in here. But on the other hand, what you're really doing is like, you've got 1.8 million text strings in there, and you say like 15 of these are going to define my skills. And even if you look at 10 different skill dimensions, you're still using like less than per mil of all the things that people have reported as as skills on their LinkedIn profiles. And so you're losing out a lot of that. And I'm really concerned that that is really like driven by researchers, because we, like, for example, once we looked at social skills, a lot of what you get in there totally depends on which keywords you put in there, to be honest. And I wanted to avoid that. So we tie our hands, we just let the data do these clusterings. I think that on most of the classes we're getting, it makes total sense how these are combined together. There's a few where you would, as a researcher, rather actually change that a little bit, but that's exactly not what we're going to do to like have the data speak. And what I'm going to show you whenever I'm going to talk about these things, not very often actually, we usually just use the two most frequent text strings in each of these skill clusters to name the skill, so you the cluster, so you directly see from the data what's in there. And the way we're measuring it, we're talking about that we're just going to count the number of reported skills in each cluster for each individual. So we know each individual has like 0, 1 to 5 text strings in this cluster. For some analysis, just to talk about that right away as well, we're going to take these 48 clusters and, like, to give it a bit more structure, assign them to 3 different skill domains, again in a very comprehensive and rule-based ways. So we thought, like, a lot of the literature here discusses specific versus general skills, and so we wanted to at least look at whether there's a difference in there. So specific skills are skills that are concentrated in a small set of occupations. And the way how we define it, we just look at our data and do a Gini coefficient on how these skills are reported across whatever 300-something occupations. And that's just like a third of the skills clusters that are most specific on this measure, we're going to call specific skills. The others are general skills within the general skills. So these general skills are used across a wide range of occupations then. And within there's one specific group of skills that we realized we should actually also like use as a different domain. And these are managerial skills. And we measure just that by how frequently these skill clusters are observed in top executive jobs as opposed to non-top executive jobs. So these are the 3 types of skills we just use for more aggregate description, really nothing more than that. And so here's examples, or really like what we're looking at. So these are the 48 clusters of skills that we're looking at. There are specific ones, managerial ones, and non-managerial general ones. So the specific ones, if you look at that, there's actually quite a few clusters that come from health, science, or engineering type of skills. So there's one skill cluster called AutoCAD SolidWorks. So these are basically the 2 most frequent skill strings that are in this cluster. There's one biotech, molecular biology, clinical research, engineering, healthcare, or Revit SketchUp. So these are examples of skill clusters that come out of this clustering analysis. Then there's, among the specific ones, quite a few that are more in the area of finance and law, like accounting or insurance or legal research. And then there's some relatively specific type of IT programming skills, like there's actually 2 Java clusters, there's SQL or Windows Server type of thing. So these are examples of these skill clusters that emerge in there, so you get an idea of what it is that we're measuring there. Among the managerial skill clusters, there's one group that's more in the area of leadership, planning, and strategy, like coaching, project management. And there's others that are more in the analysis management type of things. You can also see there one is like called analysis, and business analysis, marketing, program management. There's actually, so for example, here's like sales and strategic planning is one of the skill classes where you would think, okay, why? Like as a researcher, I would actually probably subdivide that sales is something somewhat different from strategic planning. The clustering algorithms put it together because they seem to be going together very often. And this is like one example where probably we're not super happy with this kind of clustering, but at the end, I think nearly all others actually look quite well. And so this is what comes out of the data. So of course, these general skills are a much more diverse group. There are some that are kind of in the communication area, you could say. So they are used across many different occupations. Actually, one is called communication, editing, or things like public speaking, social media. Then there's clusters on basic business functioning, like customer satisfaction, inventory, process improvement. And then there's basic software skills. Like, so these are the very specific software skills, but there's others like Access, MS Office, or as you point out, Windows is another one in there. Of course, some of these clusters are very common. Others are like like much fewer people have them, and so there's a lot of variation across all these things.
Do you also try to measure the depth of these skills? So, I mean, you know, for instance, you report here MATLAB. So there could be someone who is able to load data into MATLAB and maybe also run a first regression. But then there's another participant who is using MATLAB for 10 years and can run a simulated method of moments, for instance. So I was thinking you could maybe use the variation of agents over time in terms of their age and also in terms of their career development. So if you see, for instance, there's somebody who's working since 6 years already in this industry and he kind of sharply developed in terms of career, I guess the skill level is different than somebody who reports MATLAB after 1 year and just arriving at that job. Yeah. So I was just wondering whether you could tease out variation in terms of depth of these.
No, it's kind of, I mean, it relates to the discussion we had beforehand, which I think, in principle, I would love to go down that road, and we're basically not doing it. So we're just counting. And so one thing that's in there, it's probably the person who's very proficient in MATLAB will probably have a handful of skill strings in this cluster. So at least this intensity we do observe. It's going to be correlated with like the depth, but it's not really directly observing it. I think, so the problem here is that we just have a cross-section, and that's actually part of the data. If like we always thought about like trying to get at individual level panel data on these things, but it just didn't happen for data reasons. But then, you know, doing it based on how long they've been working, say, in this particular job or something, has the problem that it would really be circular, because at the end of the day, like this is something we want to predict out, and then you would artificially create a correlation in there. And that's why I probably wouldn't, like for the purpose of what we are doing, wouldn't want to do that, because then you would be very critical about what we are doing. But I see the point. I mean, anything in these directions, also in terms of hierarchies of skills, or for example, could enrich this analysis. I totally agree.
Just a quick question, Ludger. Do you have by any chance like the timestamp when they updated this skill information, right? You don't have a panel, but maybe you have a quasi-panel by either like a timestamp, or sometimes people create like an event out of this, right? I achieved this skill or something. I think you can choose it on LinkedIn, whether it's like a public post or something.
Right. It's probably not at the time anyway, but some of these features actually that we know these days actually weren't there at the time, but that's a different question. No, we don't. Actually, we did go back and forth with Revelio Labs about trying to see timestamps. So the only thing that we can observe is that when these things were scraped. And then we can observe when they updated their profiles. And that's going to be the subgroup analysis that I'm going to talk about. But otherwise, unfortunately not. So there was actually something in the data where we actually hoped we had these timestamps, but at the end, and actually then Revelio Labs themselves had to like work deeply into what exactly these things are, and at the end we realized it's not what we were hoping it was. Okay, then there's a lot of additional variables. I think I shouldn't spend much time on this here, although it's actually important to understand, but time-wise I actually have to get to something more interesting. But so education, we basically classify the educational degrees, their field of study, their university ranking. That's actually stuff that we did ourselves once we saw the data. We're going to have work experience based on the employment since their first degree. We're going to have occupation, geographical location. Then there's other variables that we don't actually observe on LinkedIn, but that we infer from LinkedIn. So for example, when I talk about gender, that's something that Revelio Labs has like an algorithm to infer it just from the first names. And that seems to be working well for 99.5% of individuals. And then there's a range where it's more uncertain. So we kind of have a likelihood of the gender of this in here. But that's what gender is based on. It's just based on names, nothing else. In a sense, it's good, so it doesn't do an inference from the job they're doing or anything. And for age, we went back and forth, but basically we do observe, we don't observe age, but for the sample that we ultimately have, we observe either your high school graduation rate or the year you started college, and we assume you were 18 when you did that. So that's how we infer age. Then most importantly, so I do have to talk about this a little bit, is this earnings data that we quickly talked about so far. So we don't have individual level earnings. The earnings variation, the variables we have are either going to be based on your job or based on your occupation. So what Revelio Labs has in there, but that's a big black box for us, they have their proprietary model to predict individuals' earnings. And the way they're doing it is based on their job. And so you observe certain job characteristics. They're very different from your standard administrative data set. You actually observe the job title, you observe the exact firm and location where you're working. And based on these information, they have this algorithm to predict, and the data they use to train this model comes from kind of 3 different types of data sets. Like wherever you have public salary data, like some of this is from job postings where you also have these information, and then there's this visa application data for H-1B visas where you have that information and that's accessible, and then websites that like Levels, FYI, and others. So in all these, you actually have these types of information as well, and so you can then predict the most likely earnings that this individual has. So it's very fine-grained, but it's not individual level. It's also luckily not based on any of the skill data, because that would be circular again. But then again, no other data set has this type of skill data, so they couldn't even use that. Now this is kind of like, at the one hand, probably a very neat type of way of predicting individual, like job-based earnings. On the other hand, is a big black box, and so we got more and more concerned about that, and so we started to do our own analysis. We used the American Community Survey, so this is a representative administrative data in the US, and like we did different things. At some stage we did individual level matching based on observables between the 2 data sets. At the end, what we're doing is a very simple thing. We just take the average occupational, average earnings of your occupation in the ACS, because it gives you very similar, qualitatively similar results. Of course, we only learned that after spending several months to do these analyses. But so when we first had this and then looked at the data we have, this is at the occupation level. Here's your job-based earnings based on this Revelio Labs algorithm. These are our data from ACS, and you see that they look very similar, which is kind of interesting. They really come from very different sources, and I would have thought that Revelio Labs things could introduce lots of biases, but actually on average, it's very, very consistent at the occupation level. That made me feel somewhat better, and you're going to see that analysis qualitatively come to very similar results. Okay, let's drop the sample selection, but let me talk a little bit comparing our sample on LinkedIn, the ultimate analysis sample that we have, compared to the universe of college graduates in the US labor market that we get from the ACS. So in general, actually our sample is somewhat younger than a representative sample and somewhat more male. That actually has been shown before in different analysis of LinkedIn, probably makes sense. But we can look at some other things where you generally see, look, they're not exactly the same, but they're also not super wide off. So this here is based on your highest educational degree. Here's associates. The blue one is our data. The gray one is the representative ACS. So we are somewhat underrepresented in terms of associate degrees, overrepresented about bachelor and master, and pretty good in terms of professional degrees and doctorates. We can look at occupation groups, but let me actually turn to field of study, which gives you kind of the same type of story. You see the overall pattern is very similar, but then we are somewhat overrepresented in business majors and in STEM majors. They are more likely on LinkedIn. And we are underrepresented in health and medicine and in social sciences. And again, that makes, to me, a lot of sense. These are people more likely to work in the public sector, less likely to be on LinkedIn. But at least the overall height of the bars is quite similar. In terms of regions in the US, we actually pretty nicely follow the representative thing. So I think what we take away from this year is that the LinkedIn sample is broadly representative of US workers who have a college degree. There are some differences. It's not a random sample. But what I'm not going to show you, but I'm going to tell you, and you can look at the appendix if you want. So the key results are very similar when we reweight the LinkedIn sample using the ACS weights based on all these observables that you see here. So it's not going to be driven by these differences. Okay, with that, we can finally go to some of our results. Let's first look at how these skills actually like relate to our more classical measures of human capital investments like experience and education. Let me skip this in a matter of time and just jump into it. So here's the first thing, how, because like we had this age earnings profile in mind, let's just look at how the most basic skill measures, which is just the number of reported skills, I'm going to show some other things in a minute, but just this simple measure, like varies with age in our cross-section here, and you basically see this concave pattern, like the older you are, the more skills on average people have reported, and it's quite steep to begin with, and then flattens out. One funny thing about these type of data, the dots you see are actually not dots, they are confidence intervals. So it's pretty cool. No, but when I first saw this, I thought like, oh, this is exactly as in the old Mincer book. So like, if you take the ACS to do an age earnings profile for college graduates with current data, it looks like this, and you basically, it just has a very similar shape. It's very consistent with actually this age earnings profile actually being related to differences in terms of skill accumulation while on the job. Now, just to be explicit about this, we are a cross-section, so this could be age effect, it could also be cohort effect. And it's probably going to be a mixture of the two. I mean, just as any of this work in Mincer and the tradition since then, these cross-sectional data wouldn't allow us to separate age from cohort effects. For these age earnings profiles, there actually have been studies where they actually have longitudinal data, in, like particularly in Scandinavia and so on, where interestingly, actually, these cross-sectional and the longitudinal profiles actually look quite similar. And in that sense, it's probably we're not totally off in interpreting this mostly as effects of age, but there will be cohort effects in there as well, I guess. I would say it's unlikely to be mostly driven by cohort effects. That would be surprising given the other results, but that's an open question in here. Now, if we subdivide, okay, now so this was just age because we often like to look at age profiles, but we can actually observe experience in our data, and the whole idea is this is about job experience. We can actually distinguish between potential experience, which was what you usually have, like the years since graduation until today. We can look at actual experience, which is like from your job histories, we know all the breaks in between. And so this is somewhat, so it looks the same as with age, not surprisingly in our data set. And it's a bit more steep for actual experience rather than potential experience, which is consistent that this actually has something to do with actually work and not just getting older. You can get that like if we, so of course the data, like the sample that we have is probably a pretty labor market attached type of sample because they have LinkedIn profile, they are around there. If we like try to measure labor market attachment, like do a bit stronger split in the sense that we look at your labor market attachment ratio, meaning the actual experience over potential experience, and just subdivide it between people who are above or below 0.8. Then what you see, this is the high labor market attachment people, and this is the low labor market attachment people. You actually see that those who have a relatively low labor market attachment tend to accumulate fewer skills in the reported way than those with actual. So again, consistent with this being something related to actually working. We can also look at the skill composition, at least at the broad measurement by age. So we just looked at the number of skills so far. Let's look at these three categories of skill clusters that we have. So the yellow one here is general type of skills. And the blue one is specific, job-specific, like occupation-specific skills, and the reddish one is managerial skills. And what you see is that when people enter the labor market after graduating from college, most of their skills, 80%, are actually fall into the general type categories. And then over time, they accumulate more and more, so this is in terms of shares, more and more job-specific skills and more managerial skills, and like as a result, as a share, the general skills are reduced, which again, I think is super interesting, quite makes a lot of sense in the sense that what you learn in educational institutions is just more general type of skills, and then once you're on the job, you start to accumulate by work experience, by learning on the job, much more specific and managerial type of skills. What I like about this picture is that you kind of have a general measurement of skills, of different types of skills, independent of where they come from, whether they come from like your education or from your training. We can even observe where they come from. But you have this type of skill measurement that combines both sources and tells you something about the pattern that develops over. If we look at the number, the number of skills and the different types of skills by different measures of your educational degrees. So this was more about age and experience so far. So actually, yeah, so this was age. It looks the same if you look at experience. You see that the number of skills increases somewhat with the basic degrees from associate, bachelor to master. Professional degrees and doctorates are somewhat falling out of that pattern. So it's not that they report more number of skills. But you do see that they are much more likely to report specific skills as opposed to the other types of skills, like professional degrees and doctorates than the other three. And here you've got like managerial and general ones. Then we can also look at the field of study. This is ordered by the average earnings of people with these degrees on the labor market. So we really don't see a pattern in the number of skills in terms of fields of study. But you do see that fields of studies that pay higher on the labor market tend to have more specific skills, a larger share of specific skills on their profiles, like law or STEM and health and medicine, with the exception of business. But business actually has a much larger share of managerial skills, which also makes a lot of sense in the data. And you can also look at the US college ranking. You're just like kind of the quality of the college that you went to, which we also like did our own algorithms to code. You see nothing in terms of the number of skills. That's kind of interesting that they report. But you do see that like the more people who went to the more top schools are more likely to have specific skills and managerial skills. So this is kind of some patterns you see in these data. So it's not just, particularly the number of skills is really not so super strongly related to the educational background that you have. Like the type of skills is a bit more related to it. Okay, this was all a bit about like how these skills measures relate to your classical investment measures. How do they relate to kind of outcomes? So it's this, remember, it's these job-based earnings. It's not individual earnings. It's kind of, in a sense, the likelihood that you get into a job that on average pays higher wages. And here's what that looks like. Here's the number of reported skills. Here's your log annual job-based earnings. And you see a clear positive pattern that's actually not far from linear among most parts of the number of reported skills. So it's consistently so that people who do report more skills are more likely to be in jobs that pay higher wages. Like this, the pattern is like you, for each additional skills on your profile, you tend to be in a job that pays roughly 0.67 log points higher earnings. So you see this very like consistent pattern in there. If you do this by the different types of skills, here's again your earnings, and here we got like yellow is again the general skills, blue is the specific skills, red is the managerial skills. You see that actually there's a very consistent pattern that people who report more specific and more managerial skills are more likely to be in higher paid jobs. Then you can do this for each of these 48 clusters individually, run a regression and put all of them in together. I don't want to go into any of these individual things, not sure how you would want to interpret these. It's of course a very descriptive analysis, but what you generally see is, so these are the skills that fall into the specific type, and you do see actually very strong skill coefficients in standard earnings regressions. It's also true for most of these managerial type of skills, and then it's more different for the general type of skills. There's a few that actually also are consistently associated with being into higher paying jobs, and there's others where that's much less the case. And the lowest category in here, in these types, is like all relative to this category, is customer satisfaction, but the next one is then communication, and then the next one is already Microsoft Office. So it's probably a bad idea to report that on your LinkedIn profile. It's probably, if anything, it's a negative signal of your earnings potential. Now, I think this is not sure like what you want to take away from this. I think you should really view it as a descriptive feature. But then, like, to get a bit broader idea of like how strongly these type of skill measures are or are not related to our earnings measure, we're just going to run standard Mincer regression. So standard regressions where the dependent variable is log job-based earnings, and we regress it on different measures of human capital that we have. So the classical Mincer type of analysis, what you would have potentially experienced in is squared, and generally years of schooling, we actually put in a set of highest degrees. These are all college graduates, so the degrees that we saw. You're accounting for like 14% of the earnings variation in our data. Of course, we can go much richer in terms of these education and experience measures in our data. So we actually have actual experience, but we also have field of study in a very detailed way. We have the college ranking. And if you add all this to the model, you account for 23.5% of the variation. This is standard OLS one. So we wanted to see to what extent actually if you do a richer modeling of these features, to what extent you can account for more variation. So we do these random forest type of analysis that basically allow for much more non-linearities, both in how these individual measures are related to earnings, but also interactions between the two. Actually, for these measures, it doesn't make any difference in terms of predictive power. Now, what happens if we, instead of these classical measures, use these skill-based measures? First, a very simple model where we just have 3 variables in there, which is the number of skills that you saw so far, and then these two of the 3 skill shares, is like share of specific and share of managerial skills. So 3 variables you put in there, you already account for 17% of the earnings variation in the job-based earnings, so slightly more than the classical Mincer type of analysis. If we go richer and like include like all 48 skill clusters that we have in here in the analysis, you account for a quarter of the earnings variation. And here, if you do the more flexible random forest analysis, actually you go to like 30%. So this is kind of the idea, like 30% of the job-based earnings measure that we have in here of the variation in it is related to the things we observe in terms of skills, which is actually slightly more than the classical measure. So there seems to be really something interesting in there. And if you like combine all of them together, like in the random forest one, you account for 36%. So meaning that there's 2 things. There's actually more to that than that. I mean, the increase from here to here is not that super large. From here to there is actually much more substantial. It really means that actually the skill measures that we observe can account for a lot of earnings variation within the variation spelled out by these classical measures. It's also, and they also mediate a lot of these classical measures. So for example, if you look at the dummies for the field of studies that we have in here, once we condition on the skill measures that we have, the coefficients on these field of study dummies tend to be cut roughly in half, which means that a lot of these field of study things actually seem to be mediated through the skill measures. So this was all based on this job-based earnings measure. If we go to our alternative measure, it's very simple, just average occupational earnings. You see that on average, we account for less of the variation in there, not quite surprisingly, but the pattern across the columns is kind of the same. It's kind of like we account for a bit more than the classical measures with our skill measures, and overall, we get to 33%. So I guess the qualitative results here are then not driven by anything that's specific to Revelio Lab's algorithm. It's really there in a very simple, very aggregate kind of earnings measure. And I mean, something that I was a bit hesitant to do, but that relates a little bit to what you have asked before. And we can also take our Revelio Labs-based earnings measure and take out any occupational variation. So meaning, like, take this measure, regress it on a full set of occupational dummies, and just take the residual. So how much of the variation of earnings within occupations can we account for? So I hate Mincer regressions with occupational dummies in there, which I think doesn't really make a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, at least descriptively, it is interesting to see whether we can add anything to earnings variations beyond the classical measures that we often have had in previous analyses, like occupations as well. And even within the occupations, like, we account for less of the variation, but actually it's not zero, and the pattern is again very, very similar. So we do actually also with these measures do the skill measures even though you may be concerned that they, for example, actually several of these measures, particularly the specific ones, may actually capture effects of occupations. If you totally ignore occupations and just take variation in earnings, and these are just job-based earnings within occupations, like you're still actually explaining quite a bit of a variation. Okay, and then let me get to the final part, which is the gender skill gap. So at the end of the day, it's like the question is to what extent do human capital differences contribute or not to any gender earnings gaps. We know there are huge gender earnings gaps. The literature on these actually basically at the moment comes to the conclusion that our usual measures of human capital, meaning education and experience, if anything, contribute negatively to explaining the gender earnings gap. That was different in the 1980s, 90s. There was some sort of degree that like women tended to have lower levels of education, often like substantially less job experience, and so you could account for some part of the gender earnings gap by this. But by now, women actually on average have higher earnings, higher education than men, and they actually have caught up in terms of job experience as well, meaning that based on their observables in these dimensions, you actually the earnings gap would have to be even larger. Now, what we also see in this literature is what does actually account for like roughly half of the gender earnings gap are actually measures of occupation and industry. So there are observables that are quite relevant in there that differentiate women's jobs from men's jobs that can account for earnings differences. But as like one of these surveys of this actually has concluded, it means like it's quite hard to say what exactly, how to interpret these results. So these occupation effects, they may represent human capital or may represent other labor market skills or commitment on the one hand. They may also, on the other hand, represent employer discrimination. So it could be either way. That's very. And in a sense, now with our skill measure, we can try to see whether this is consistent actually with remaining skill differences that are actually not captured by your classical education and experience variables. Okay, let's first just look at like how our skill measure looked by gender. So the same pattern like as my first picture, age, number of reported skills, but just subdivided for men and women. This is the graph for women, and this is the graph for men. So you basically see that both have these concave shapes. They are actually the number of reported skills for people who just come out of college do not differ much by gender. There's a little bit in there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But then right there, they tend to report roughly the same number of skills. But then starting at the late 20s, this does go apart, and the gap is increasing, and then stays flat. So that on average, we see a quite substantial gender gap in that women tend to report fewer skills than men. Let's also quickly look at the skill composition by age and gender. So here's general skills, and this is women, and this is men. The blue one is, again, specific skills for women and men, and the red ones for managerial. So what you see, on average, women tend to have somewhat larger shares of general skills as opposed to specific and managerial skills, but these are very parallel over age. So they wouldn't like account for any of the age differences in these patterns. So there's somewhat in terms slight difference in skill composition, but not varying by age. Okay, so we've seen this gender gap in the number of reported skills. How should we interpret this? And so, as I indicated initially, and I'm sure that you have in mind, like one of the main problems in here, it could just be male over-reporting. You know, like a woman and a man have exactly the same type of skills. The woman is more shy, doesn't report as many of them. The man is just boasting and reporting more. That could be one explanation. Another explanation, so it's basically 4 of them I'm going to put up here. Maybe you have others in mind. I would love to discuss that further. I think these are among the most important things that we could think of. And of course, this would be I mean, would be interested at least in terms of descriptively, but then it wouldn't tell you anything about actual relevance of skills in the labor market. I think it would still be interesting to some extent, to the extent that actually what you report on LinkedIn, as we saw, is actually heavily, like, is used by employers, is more generally related to all sorts of outcomes. So this boosting may, in that sense, work, and so at least we as labor economists would like to understand it, but of course it wouldn't tell you much about the relevance of skills. A second potential explanation is there could be gender differences in profile updating. So if women are like have more interruptions or so, they may just not update their profiles as often as men. These could be occupation specific, that just like they choose different occupations in which there are different types of skill accumulations. And we know that after motherhood, women are more likely to reduce working hours or go out of the labor market, whereas men just don't do that. And if this is then related to skill accumulation, that could give rise to this pattern. What I'm going to argue is that the evidence that we have is quite inconsistent with number 1, 2, and 3, and very consistent with number 4. To the extent it's consistent with the story that really what we see here is mostly driven by this year, and that's not so much by the other ones. Okay, so what is this first idea? I mean, there is this literature out there showing that there can be gender differences in overconfidence or in self-promotion, and that would probably relate to how you report skills on LinkedIn profiles. Like initially there was like quite a hype about these things. Then more recent evidence, I think, is at least much more mixed. It shows that these overconfidence measures are very domain specific. In some domains you do see gender differences, in others not, and it seems like more generally there may not be huge differences in overconfidence. But in any case, that could be a potential explanation if it were there. There's two pieces of evidence that I think speak against this really driving our results to a large extent. The first one is, what we see is this gap grows substantially with age. So it's basically not there in the 20s, and then it grows, and then it's kind of constant. So that would require that this male overconfidence is much larger for older ages or older cohorts. And I don't, like, at least we looked around and didn't see any patterns of these in the literature that's out there. It's not totally impossible, but that's something that's probably unlikely. Did you want to?
But why is it implausible for cohorts? I mean, if I observe my daughter and compare her to me, I would think she's much more self-confident than I was. And Claudia,
okay.
To say. I mean, I think the cohort effect could very well potentially explain. And since you just have a cross-section,
Right. Now I agree that there could be something in there.
And if I may add something, wouldn't you be able to look into that by looking at soft skills? Are they reported as well? I think that tells you a lot about like confidence.
So you think that's like you would be more likely to see it in there in terms of what they are like, yeah. So I showed you the kind of the 48 clusters that come of the clustering of what people report on LinkedIn, and there's very little in terms of soft skills that people report in there as skills, which is kind of interesting. And so in that sense, I think there's like we could look at some of these subcategories of skills that you would define as soft skills and then look into that. That could be feasible. But there, you could imagine that then reporting biases could be the same or even the opposite in there, and then you're not quite sure how to interpret that either. But getting like to your joint point about that there could be cohort effects in there, absolutely correct. But actually the studies that I've seen on overconfidence don't have that in there. But I agree. That's feasible. There's a second piece that we should actually look a bit more deeply into that. But I did think about these things, although anyway, it is a possibility, and I don't want to put that. I mean, a couple of months ago, I presented this in the labor seminar at Harvard, and then Claudia Golden was there, and I thought like, oh, what she would look at. And actually, before I went to this here, like I was like, we were at this stage, and then I was saying, look, it could be male overreporting, and she was just interrupting, saying, oh, nonsense, that couldn't explain how they could go apart. I thought, thank you. So at least she knows much more about these things than I do, and she thought it's probably not very consistent with this. But like this doesn't totally rule it out. I absolutely agree. There's a second thing we did, and actually now that I think about it, we actually should do this separately by age group, and we haven't done that. So if male overreporting would really be a big issue, we would expect that employers would at some stage start to discount men's skill information. You know, like employers after a while have seen the workers and know how productive they are to some extent, and then if you would see that men are always just boasting things that they don't have, like you wouldn't pay on that. And that's something we can look at, and in our data, the skills that are reported by men and the skills that are reported by women are pretty equally associated with higher paying jobs. If anything, actually, the coefficient is slightly larger for men. So that also speaks against the huge, like, rampant over-reporting in here. Now it's actually that I'm thinking about it, I think the next thing I want to do is do this for younger people and older people to see whether that's different, because that would be consistent with that, but we haven't looked at that. Okay, second thing. So we know that men, like from labor literature, men tend to have higher labor career aspirations. They are more mobile. They're more likely to change jobs and so on. You know, this may make them to update their profiles more often and therefore actually then have more skills in there. Now here comes in the analysis that we can do for recent job switchers. So here we just look at a sample of people. I think in this picture that we look at is like who have changed their employer in the past 2 years. You can do it for 1 year. The sample gets smaller, but the pattern is the same. So here the yellow one is the thing we looked at before. It's the number of reported skills for women and men for the entire sample. The blue one is these job switcher samples. So you see, and that I think makes a lot of sense, they are like the people who have like changed their job over the past 2 years tend to report more skills. They are more active on the labor market, and there may be several in here that are still like dormant type of profiles. But the pattern is the same. There's hardly any gender difference here. It starts opening here and then is flat again out there. I mean, one of the differences that's in there is that among job switchers, even among the older ones, this still tends to be increasing rather than flat, which I think is also interesting, that even like when you're still actually updating your profile in this subgroup that's there. But if anything, actually the gender gap here is larger for the job switchers than the entire sample. So this gender difference pattern cannot be driven by lack of updating. Another potential explanation would be that there's occupational differences in skill accumulation, and then like it's just that women tend to sort into occupations that give you less chances of learning more over time, or maybe could also be employer discrimination based on certain occupations. So one simple way one way that you can do this is like do a counterfactual where we take women's actually reported skills, but weigh them by the occupational composition of men. So basically, you know, there's much more nurses among the female group than in the male group, so we actually do as if the share of, like we still take the number of skills observed by female nurses, but weigh them by the share of men who are nurses, and then the same for STEM fields and so on. So it takes out the gender differences in the occupational structure. Once you do that, so here, these are the initial two graphs we have had all the time. You get the one that's in between here. And it's kind of interesting that at the young ages here, like you fully close the gender gap in skills by like occupation. So the little difference that's there is fully explained by differences in occupational choice between women and men. And once you account for that, they actually tend to report exactly the same thing. But then you basically use, like, in a sense, like the absolute gap that you keep explaining by occupations stays constant means that overall you tend to explain very little, you don't explain anything of the growing gender gap with the occupational information, and you don't account for the lion's share of the overall skill gap. So it's not, it does exist within occupations the same way. Okay, then we come to the final hypothesis, and this is that we know that women have more career interruptions and they work fewer hours, particularly when they've become parents. And there's this, like Claudia Golden has shown, that there are certain very highly paying occupations that do reward longer hours, in the sense that, like in this very like greedy occupations, it's not just like that you earn more if you work longer hours because you work more hours, but even for each hour you earn more. And this is kind of a static effect of hours work on hourly wages. And our hypothesis here is there could be a dynamic effect of this as well, in the sense that this reduced female work hours would lead to slower accumulation of skills on the job. Now, we cannot observe motherhood in the LinkedIn profiles. We actually cannot observe hours worked in the LinkedIn profiles. So we cannot test this directly, but what we do here is a cell-based approach. So we do define cells of workers based on 2-year age bins, so very detailed age, 4 degrees of education, and 9 census divisions. And then for each of these cells, we can observe in our data the slope of the age skill profile. So basically, like how many more skills you report age 25 rather than 23. We can do that for women and men. And then for the same kind of cells in the ACS data, we can actually observe the average annual work hours and actually the share of women who, in this specific cell, who have children in the household aged 0 to 18. That's kind of the best measure of motherhood you can have in here. Now, I've got to be quick because I want to show you a final little thing in the end. But to give you the basic idea here, here's in our data, the skill growth of each cell. So each dot is one of these cells for men as opposed to women. And you see, like within the same cell, women on average tend to accumulate fewer skills than men. That's kind of what we saw in our graph. It's kind of interesting if you do the same picture and subdivide it just at the mean of the ratio of hours worked by females and males in the respective cell. So think about in the same. So these are same age, same degree, same region, and then women versus men in that cell. You actually see that in cells where women tend to work closer, more similar hours than men, this is much more one-to-one, and it is really very different where women work much less hours. That in itself kind of is interesting. So you can run it in a regression model. Is basically dependent variable here is the female skill growth, and so you regress it on male skill growth and the female-male working hours ratio in the cell and their interaction, and you see actually this is strongly positive. It's actually substantially larger than 1, meaning that in a specific cell, when women work less hours than men in that cell, their skill accumulation is going to be substantially lower than the one of men. Now, if we relate, I'm sorry, I'm basically out of time, but I may use this 2 minutes to go there. If you just relate this female-male hours ratio in the cell to the fraction of women who have children in the cell, you have a very clear negative association. So the more likely that women in the cell have children, the lower is their hours worked in the cell relative to the men in the cell. And now you can combine all this together. So basically, let's look at, project out for each cell what the female-male hours ratio would be if they wouldn't have any children in the cell. Take this, this female-male hours ratio times the male skill growth to predict a counterfactual female skill growth that would happen if there wouldn't be work reductions because of motherhood. Just a simple kind of thought experiment. And once you do this counterfactual skill growth of women against of men is kind of this is very close to the 45-degree line here, meaning if you plot that into a counterfactual female age skill profile, where you just take out the hours effect due to motherhood and what that means descriptively for skills in our data, then you get at this one that looks very similar to the male one. So just descriptively here in our data, if women in each cell would actually work as many hours as men, in the sense the reduction of work hours that we observe because of motherhood, then actually there wouldn't be any skill gap. So it seems like this skill gap is really much driven by the fact that women, when they're in the late 20s, early 30s, start to work fewer hours and more likely to be out of the job, therefore accumulate fewer skills. And if they wouldn't do that, they would have the same type of skill accumulation than men. Okay, just final thing. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you do a simple Gender wage gap, regress earnings on gender, that's like 22% in our data. With like the detailed Mincer type of analysis, particularly field of study, you would account for roughly a third of that skill gap, more flexibly 40%. But with our skill data, just as in the previous analysis, just with the 3 measures, we account for a third of the gender gap in earnings, and more richly for 60%. So these are the skill variation we have in here is very closely related to the gender earnings gap and can account for quite a chunk of it. Same cross occupations and within occupations. Okay, this would just be summarizing what I've been saying so far anyway, so thanks a lot for your attention.